Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for rogues and genial misfits of high wattage. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Dr. Robert Zubrin on the benefits and safety of nuclear energy, and I did a bonus episode with anti-nuclear advocate Helen Caldicott. And it all got me interested in energy in general. Specifically, how do energy experts approach energy? Are the people in the know about this kind of thing partisans for particular sources? They like wind power, but they're mortal enemies with coal, or they favor natural gas, but bioethanol is a shame. Is solar power scalable to the point that we could use it for all of our needs, or is it too hampered by matters of efficiency or economics to ever become truly mainstay? To answer these questions, I tracked down Dr. Michael Weber, an energy expert who happens to live in Austin, Texas, and I can't tell you how much I wish we'd had more time to do this interview. Dr. Weber is one of the smartest, quickest guests I have ever interviewed. This is a slightly shorter episode, but I think you'll agree with me that we basically squeezed 2 hours of high-octane energy knowledge into 45 minutes, and I think you'll enjoy it very much. In fact, I am so excited that I'm going to rush through the regular Patreon plug to get to the interview sooner. Here goes. Hey, the show's funded by you. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton and support the show. Patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. My guest today is Dr. Michael Weber. He is the Josie Centennial Professor in Energy Resources. He is an author and the Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches and conducts research at the convergence of engineering, policy, and commercialization. He has authored more than 500 scientific articles, columns, books, and book chapters, including op-eds in the New York Times and features in Scientific American. In fact, at the time of recording, he just had a paper drop in the New York Times and is going to immediately go from me to go hang out at PBS. So we have a guest of some renown and expertise who's named to come on the program. Thank you, Dr. Weber.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
I'm very excited to talk to you because I am impacted by energy policy, and I know very little about energy beyond, I think, the average consumer. So my kickoff question for you is, how do energy experts like you think about energy? And I ask that because I feel like a lot of the time in discourse, it gets dumbed down to like evil energy and good energy, and I'm curious as to how energy people think of it.
I think most energy experts, like people who study this for a living or who are deep in the energy industry, think about energy in terms of trade-offs, that there's no form of energy, no fuel or technology that is all good or all bad. They are all good and bad. And so designing an energy system that meets our various priorities, say for reliability and cleanliness and affordability, is really about mixing and matching the different options to maximize the good and minimize the bad. But we'll always have some impact and we'll always get some benefits. It's just a matter of making it better for our needs.
You are speaking my language. I think almost all policy discussions are ultimately trade-off discussions, and there's rarely just a solution. There's trade-offs, and there can be overwhelming ones. So this is wonderful. This means that I can back my way into the world of energy, as I think my bearings are already there.
Totally. It means you're in a safe space for this. We can have a trade-offs discussion.
Great. Well, actually, that's my next question is, we've known each other 6 minutes, I think, but you seem very genial and open. I'm with academics in energy, are there any third rails? Like if you wrote an op-ed about you're in favor of nuclear power or you see benefits to coal or something like that, do you not get invited to cocktail parties, or is energy kind of insulated from that sort of thing?
There are a couple different sort of dangerous zones for academics, and it often has to do with advocacy. If you advocate very aggressively for or against something, that starts to raise eyebrows with different crowds, by the way. If you take money from one type of entity but not another, that can be a problem.
Okay.
If you talk about population and population control, that's probably the trickiest third rail. But I would say that of all the sort of things I bump into, it often comes down to the fuels and the sponsors. So there are a couple of things to think about that. My spot, my niche, and aren't that many of us in my space, is I'm the climate warrior and environmentalist who doesn't hate oil and gas. And that's not a very crowded space. So there are a lot of climate warriors who really hate oil and gas, the fuels, and hate oil and gas companies. And I don't. I work with oil and gas companies on how to decarbonize. And I think that the molecules themselves might have some role in the future. And that makes me not alone, but different than a lot of sort of energy analysts and environmentalists. And that will show up in different advocacy. So there are a lot of environmentalists who advocate for the end of fossil fuels, for example. And I like to say we need the end of unmitigated fossil fuels. Fossil fuels that are allowed to pollute that's bad. And so therefore fossil fuels, if we're going to use them, shouldn't be allowed to pollute. But that doesn't mean the end of fossil fuels, because there are ways to make fossil fuels cleaner. So I occupy like a different space, but whether you're for or against fossil fuels or for or against nuclear or for or against wind, there are different people who take sides. That's kind of the trickiest space when you become an advocate, say, for one set of solutions. The other tricky space is who your funders are. And there are a couple ways to deal with this in academia, but generally the rule of thumb is transparency is better than not being transparent. And so I list all my funders in my papers, whoever sponsored that work, but also all my funders overall on my website and in my resume. I disclose many places. And I have research support for my students from oil and gas companies and environmental groups and environmental activists and foundations that are dedicated to climate change. So I have funding from a lot of different entities that have different interests in the energy world. And I like to think that there's no neutral funding, but we can neutralize the funding. But if you are a research group that only gets money, say, from environmental advocacy organizations or only takes money from oil and gas, that might make you appear biased, even if you're not biased. And so these are things that experts have to worry about is what is the appearance of bias? Is there actual bias? Are we advocating for one thing or another? And then the last one I kind of hinted at is population control discussions. There's no faster way to kill the mood on a public panel at a scientific conference than have someone say there's just too many damn people on the earth, we need population control. And that's not my view, but that is a view held by a non-trivial number of people. And that becomes really difficult to talk about, because if you talk about population control, if you believe that's important, the policy options are all gross.
Yeah, it's fascinating you would bring that up, because from my vantage point, not knowing the technical side of this at all, I can look at the ideological side of this, and I do see kind of two nascent intellectual camps that I don't really think are correlated with political party, but I see one group of people that are very humanist, that tend to think in terms of trade-offs and how do we help a lot of poor people. That tends to be the focus. And then the other group that strikes me as kind of religious, and this idea that humans are kind of bad, and what we ought to do is just not impact anything. And the goal is really just to lower impact more than anything else, which usually involves restricting energy and potentially restricting population.
And the truth is humans are good and bad. So we should absolutely reduce our impact as much as we can. And we should also improve the human condition as much as we can. These are two thoughts we can have in our head at the same time. And that means we need to reduce the impacts for the 8 billion people who have access and increase access for the billion who don't. And that's just electricity. If you add in a lack of access to piped water or sanitation or other modern fuels, say propane for cooking instead of wood and cow dung, there are a couple billion people. So there are a lot of people who would benefit from increased access to energy. And there are a lot of people who need to decrease their impacts because they already have full access and they're using the dirty stuff when they could use the clean stuff. So we can do both. The pro-access argument tends to be one industry makes, because it is new markets and new customers, and is easier to think about growing your market share than it is to think about cleaning up your act. And those of us who are already rich and have a lot of energy access tend to think about reducing impacts because we already have the access. It's hard for us to understand what life is like without electricity or having to walk a few miles to get water and that kind of thing. So we are biased by our own experience about where we focus, but the truth is we need to do both.
That makes sense to me. Like I was persuaded by some arguments made by the Niskanen Center a few years ago, and they're advocates of a carbon tax, which I like the idea of because it would incentivize the market to move away from carbon. But the best argument that I've heard proposed against that is, I, Andrew Heaton, can take that on the chin. If we're going to increase my food costs by 10% or something like that, I can do that. But for people that are on below the poverty threshold, that might be a really difficult thing for them to stomach. And from my vantage point, I don't have to think about that as hard.
So the market-oriented libertarians like Niskanen and others will say, well, let's use the most efficient mechanism. And if you ask 100 economists, 99 will say, put a price on pollution. That's the most efficient way to reduce pollution. And frankly, I agree. The comment that it might make energy too expensive for poor people might not add up, because our energy is already expensive for those poor people, in that I'm getting the benefit of the energy and they're getting all the environmental impacts.
Okay,
right?
So we're talking globally here.
We're looking globally, yeah. So I am benefiting from my battery, but as some 12-year-old kid in a mine for cobalt in the Congo or something that's suffering. Or I'm getting access to all this coal-fired electricity, but it's sub-Saharan Africans suffering from the droughts and heat waves. So the people who don't have access to energy are suffering from lack of access to energy and suffering the environmental consequence of my access to energy.
Got it.
So making it more expensive for me might make that energy more expensive for them, I guess. Maybe. I'm not even convinced that's true, frankly, but it will make the environmental impacts lower, which is already expensive for them.
Right.
So if you take a more global look at it, actually, we should do what we can to clean up the global environment, because the people who suffer are not the consumers. It's not the rich Texans who are suffering, although actually rich Texans are suffering now with droughts and heat waves and hurricanes, this kind of thing. But it's really kids in Bangladesh who haven't been born yet who are going to suffer. And this is a very complicated policy problem for us to tackle, which is the people who must take action today are different than the people who will benefit halfway around the world 100 years from now. That's a complicated policy problem. But that's what we need to do. And that takes a very sort of sophisticated compassion and global thinking to get to.
Great. Well, I am here for that discussion. So, on that note, when I'm buying products from China, and a lot of the stuff I buy is from China, how much of the energy, how much of my purchases are just transferring energy away from clean stuff in America to coal plants over there? Because I'm thinking it's probably quite a lot that we take from the rest of the world.
It's significant. Yeah. So by cleaning up our act, United States, we actually just push the emissions up, the smokestacks to China. That's one way to think about it. And the numbers are hard to get, but it might be anywhere from like 500 million to 1 billion tons of CO2 a year. So this is like a non-trivial amount of our total emissions. So it's like 5 to 15% or something like that. So it's not the vast preponderance of it, but it is still non-trivial. And it is sort of false of us to convince ourselves like, oh, look, we're cleaner when we're buying dirty stuff from China. Not only are our factories cleaner, but our power plants powering those factories are also cleaner. And this cleanliness should be a competitive advantage. So for like 15 years, I've been arguing we need to put a price on pollution globally. And that will be a way to revitalize American competitiveness, because our refineries are cleaner, our power plants are cleaner, our factories are cleaner, our farms are cleaner, you name it. And we have labor justice rules that aren't experienced everywhere. And interestingly, there's some bipartisan interest in that in Washington, D.C. right now, these border-adjusted carbon taxes, where you have Democrats looking to clean up Chinese smokestacks or push manufacturing to cleaner locations. And you have Republicans looking for a way to stick it to China. And the answer is kind of the same, which is don't let China get away with dirty manufacturing. Let's hold them accountable for it through a pricing mechanism, where goods imported from China, if they're dirty, will have a fee associated with it. So we're more likely to manufacture in the United States. This is a great idea, frankly. This gives a profit incentive not to move the CO2 off my books onto their books, but to benefit from the fact that I have a lower CO2 footprint here. Anyway, so there's some bipartisan opportunity, which isn't something we say very often in the United States when it comes to energy policy or anything.
So when I'm talking to Republicans, just double down on how awful China is in terms of all the things that we could force them to pay their fair share. And when I'm talking to Democrats about how it would force everybody to clean up.
Yeah, let's use our clean American factories with good labor justice and good wages, living wages. And with Republicans, I think you say we're letting China get away with murder, frankly, with their labor practices and with their environmental footprint in order to get cheap Barbie dolls or whatever it is. And so we have an opportunity here for a variety of reasons, national security, economic revival, and environmental cleanliness, to come to the same solution, which is let's incentivize production where it's cleaner.
Okay. So to backtrack a little bit, you said that you are a climate warrior or climate crusader, whatever the phrase you used is, who is in favor of fossil fuels. How's that work?
I think so. I would say I'm a climate warrior who doesn't hate fossil fuels.
Okay.
So it's not that I'm in favor of, because I don't really put my thumb on the scale for any one or the other.
Okay.
It's more like, what do we need the energy system to be? We need it to be cleaner. We need it to be affordable. We need it to be reliable. And I'm not smart enough to know what the way is or the ways, but I can imagine all sorts of ways to get there. So I'd rather say, here's the standard, y'all figure it out, which is kind of the role of government. So my belief, like in the end, it's like an ideological belief. My belief in the role of government, that's the role of government to set the rules and enforce the rules. And it's the role of markets to figure out how most efficiently and effectively to comply with the rules in a field of competition, right? So think like,
I'm going to recommend you for Secretary of Energy.
Oh, totally. Yeah,
I'm simpatico.
We're there. So that's the role of government. It's like so the league for basketball sets the rules, the referees enforce the rules, but the players are competing within the rules to win. And the players competing is sort of the marketplace, and the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of innovation, the marketplace of adoption of new technologies. And so I like it when the government says, here is the cleanliness standard or labor standard you must meet. You figure it out. And fossil fuels should have a right to compete for that as well. And if they can, through carbon capture or scrubbing, or who knows, whatever it is, through pyrolysis or something, then great, because we have a lot of fossil fuels. And if we can mitigate the impact, why wouldn't we use fossil fuels? If fossil fuels can't comply as affordably as other solutions, well, good. Let's do the other solutions then, because that would be cheaper for the consumer and better for everyone. And what we'll find is that fossil fuels will have trouble competing in a lot of the places, but not always. There are certain places that are really hard to electrify, like aviation or marine shipping or industrial heat or chemicals or places like that, where having molecules will be really valuable. There's even some mine mouth coal mines where it's just so cheap to build a power plant at the mine mouth. You might be able to add carbon capture. That still might be cheaper than, say, building a pipeline for gas or the transmission lines for wind and solar. Who knows? I just don't want to say that analysts know the answer, but we can be pretty smart on what the rules should be. And then let fossil fuels compete. I suspect fossil fuels will decline a lot in the coming decades. I think that will end up being cheaper, cleaner, more reliable. I don't think they'll go to zero. I bet coal drops to like 10% of what it was. It is restricted to things like steel and cement. I bet oil drops mostly to plastics and aviation fuels and shipping fuels and maybe heavy duty trucking. I bet gasoline goes to nearly zero. I bet natural gas hangs in there because it's pretty useful for heat and chemicals and power generation. But, I don't know. We'll see. I bet wind and solar and geothermal and nuclear rise as well. So I think we'll have a mix. But I think it's dangerous when I or the government says, thou shalt use this or thou shall not use that. These mandates or bans end up being ineffective and contrary to what we want.
I'm very much with you. I'm concerned with outcome. I am agnostic to the method we get there. I am very critical of ascribing holiness or profaneness to energy sources. That strikes me as a really bad way of approaching this. But again, like I don't care what how we go about doing this. But like when I was a kid, we were really worked up about biofuel ethanols.
Yeah.
And from where I'm at, and please correct me, it seems to me we wasted a lot of time and money trying to make that work. Whereas if we just had an outcome-based system, it probably would have fizzled out pretty early.
There are different examples of American energy policy going back to the 70s where we either mandate something or we ban something. So starting in the 70s, there were some pushes for corn-based ethanol. We have a lot of corn. It's good politics, this kind of thing. But in particular, in 1978, we outlawed the use of natural gas for new power plants. There was a ban. There's the Industrial Fuel Use Act in 1978. We made it illegal to build new natural gas power plants in America.
But not coal?
But not coal.
Really?
In fact, that law was on the books from 1978 until 1987. And because of the natural gas ban, we built like 80 gigawatts, which is a lot, of coal-fired power plants. Because coming out of the energy crises of the 70s, we had used a lot of oil for electricity. But when oil looked expensive and unreliable and a national security risk, we said we got to get oil out of the mix. At the same time, gas looked like it was scarce, and chemical companies like Dow and others convinced American policymakers, gas is scarce, it's more important for chemicals, let's outlaw it for power plants. But we had to build something to replace the oil-fired power plants, so we ramped up on nukes and coal, both of which seem domestic and secure. Now we're trying to shut down those same coal plants because of the air pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions, but those coal plants aren't that old because we just built them 40 to 45 years ago because we couldn't build natural gas plants. So that ban really ended up having all sorts of national security and environmental and other effects on us, especially the environmental effects when it comes to acid rain and air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So that was a ban. It didn't go well. Then we have the corn-based ethanol mandate, which was bipartisan, by the way, and so was the Industrial Fuel Use Act. So these things happen.
I would think anything benefiting corn subsidies in the early presidential state of Iowa would be very popular for anybody thinking about running for president, which would be everyone in the Senate.
Everyone, and a lot of governors, and a lot of people care about this. And Iowa's early primary is not the earliest anymore. That actually might affect energy policy because it's not so important, say, in picking who the president will be or who the nominees will be. In corn-based ethanol, the idea was, in a bipartisan way, that's better to enrich Midwest farmers than Mideast autocrats. Let's use corn-based ethanol to displace imported petroleum from Saudi Arabia or wherever it is we're getting it from. Usually it's actually we're getting it from Canada, Mexico, which is a different story. And so we ramped up on the mandate, a volumetric mandate that by some date in the future, this was in 2005, we would have 36 billion gallons a year of our fuels come from corn-based ethanol, and some cellulosic sources, that kind of thing. We haven't met any of the standards other than corn for about 10% of our fuel mix for gasoline. A little bit of corn-based ethanol is fine. The ethanol is an oxygenate, so it helps convert CO to CO2. Now, that means we have more greenhouse gases, but the CO is poisonous, so we'd rather have the greenhouse gas than the poison. It lets us get higher compression ratios, so higher engine performance. That's good. But environmentally, it's not clear it saves greenhouse gas emissions. It takes a real toll on the land. It's very water consumptive. It requires a lot of energy for fermentation and making the fuel. So it looks pretty bad from an environmental perspective. And most scientists and engineers like me were jumping up and down saying this a long time ago, saying this is a stupid idea. But we did it, and we offset 10% of our gasoline use from petroleum. We could have just required our cars to become 10% more efficient, by the way. So there are other ways you could have done it. That mandate in the end looks pretty expensive. And now that gasoline consumption is about to plummet with electric vehicles, what do we do with all the corn ethanol mandates?
I remember when I was in college and was far more confident in my worldviews at that time than I am now. I had a conversation with my Uncle Dan, who's a farmer, very smart man, but very intellectually humble. And I brought up that, like, obviously we should be putting all of our resources into bioethanol fuel subsidies at that time. And he went, I don't know, Andy, it just seems like could be kind of a bad idea to connect the agricultural market with the energy market. I could see some downsides from having the prices of energy directly affect agriculture since they'd be competing for the same land. And I think in retrospect, I'm like, my farmer uncle was right about that.
He was onto it. And actually, he was already connected to the energy industry because when natural gas prices go high, then agrochemical prices go high and fertilizers go high. And so food becomes more expensive and energy is more expensive. And then we use diesel to move the food to market. And then we use propane to dry the crops in the silos. So he was already paying a high energy bill. That's probably what he was thinking. Is like, I'm already too coupled to energy as an input, and now I'm going to be coupled to energy as an output. Then this is a double whammy because some dictator halfway around the world determines my profitability that year, and it was bad enough just fighting with the weather.
Moving on to energy specific things, I think we can discount bioethanols to a great extent. I think solar is the thing that most of my friends are enamored with. I like solar. I've got a camper. I've got solar panels on top of my camper. I hear two arguments, and I'd like you to please elaborate on this. One argument is solar panels have become so cheap to make and so energy efficient that they could largely take care of our electricity needs in the United States if only we would put them on top of buildings everywhere and increase funding for lithium batteries. Group 2 says that's real cute. Even if we retrofitted all the buildings, there's just no way we could economically store enough energy to compensate for cloudy days, night, winter, and so forth, and we couldn't transmit it across the lines. So it's always going to be a fringe thing in terms of economic price. From where you're at, how effective and economic is solar panels?
Energy experts would never recommend that we use one fuel or technology option for the entire mix. So we would start with something like solar looks cheap, it's easy to build, you can slap it on sides of walls or roofs of buildings or on fields, that kind of thing. Let's build a lot of it. But how much can we build? Is it 10%, 20%, 60%? There's some limit before it becomes uneconomic because its risks become too difficult to manage. You can mitigate the risks with storage, as you mentioned, or maybe larger transmission systems or backup peakers running on natural gas or whatever it is. But there's a limit on what you can do before it becomes uneconomic. And we don't know that limit yet, but it should be a lot higher than it is now. Okay. And it's so easy to install solar. It's getting the lion's share of the market. Batteries are getting the other lion's share of the market, and then you get wind and then natural gas. Maybe geothermal will come along in a decade or so. There are a lot of geothermal startups right now doing their pilots that are breaking ground and drilling, and that'll become more relevant as time goes on. So solar looks great, and we should do it. And it's got its obvious problems. It's affected by meteorological and astronomical conditions, like whether it's cloudy or whether it's nighttime or what time of year it is, this kind of thing. And this will affect solar output, but in very predictable ways. Like we usually know the position of the Earth relative to the sun with many centuries of foreknowledge. And we can usually predict, at least with hours, but usually days in advance, what kind of cloud cover we're going to have. So there's some predictability to solar that's really useful. And there's even some solar panels that we can get that work off black body radiation and infrared that work at night.
Really?
So not as robust as daytime ones, but there's a lot of waste heat out there, and you don't have to use the visible spectrum. There's other parts of the spectrum, but the visible spectrum has better energy density, so that's the place to start. But there's new panel designs out there that you can line on, say, smokestacks where there's a lot of waste heat, giving off infrared radiation and that kind of thing.
Fascinating.
So we're not done innovating there, but I guess the main thing is, looks great, let's do more of it.
Okay.
But we're not going to do only that, and we shouldn't.
Okay.
Wind and solar are particularly interesting because they're out of phase with each other. So you can share...
This is windier at night.
Like on the continent, if you're inland, usually it's windier at night and in the spring and the fall. And solar tends to be better the opposite. So they can share substations and transmission lines, that kind of thing. You do have periods of the Germans call Dunkelflauten, where it's neither windy nor sunny, and that could be several days or even 2 weeks long in some cases. So you wouldn't want to have just wind and solar, and that's why no serious analyst proposes that we do. There's always something else on the grid as well. But solar looks like it's just going to keep getting cheaper. Frankly, It looks really good.
Okay. And in terms of batteries, in terms of the thing that we would use to compensate for Dunkelflauten,
Dunkelflauten. Yeah, exactly.
Dunkelflauten, it was pretty close.
Yeah, I want to thank the Germans for creating words for everything.
They're
by the
great.
way.
One of my good friends, he's a comedian friend of mine, Jeff Maurer, has this joke that Germans have a word for everything. That he'll be walking and he'll go, "Oh, my nephew's sad because he dropped his marbles in the creek," and a German will go, "Marble-ploppen." Yeah, sad because an orb has fallen into a body of water.
Yeah.
So for those periods of time, could you have lithium generator or lithium batteries or some other form of battery to compensate? Would that ever be economic, or are you always going to need to have a gas-powered plant that you could just throw the switch on?
There are a variety of tools for those periods of time, and I would say the best tools include things like a bigger transmission network, a lot of energy storage, of which there are many methods. Lithium-ion batteries are just one way to store energy. There are many ways, including other battery chemistries, compressed air energy storage, pumped hydroelectric, you name it, thermal storage, making fuels. You could have backup generators, which could be natural gas, and today it's diesel or whatever. You could have demand response, turning things off if you don't have the energy supply available. We should start with energy efficiency as well. So there are a variety of tools. And the first thing is if you can make your grid bigger than the weather, that helps because it's always windy and always sunny somewhere, but it's not always windy and sunny anywhere. There's no one spot that's always windy and sunny, but somewhere in the globe it's there. And so if you can just make your grid bigger, you can help reach it. And that will help, but maybe that's not enough. That's why you would add storage. Lithium-ion batteries are great. They're fast. The costs are coming down. They're pretty cheap. They're pretty compact. They're pretty light. This is great. They usually last 4 hours. Maybe we can double them and get 8 hours. But for Dunkelflauten or these longer things, you're going to want like 4 days or longer, which might be iron air batteries, like those made by Form Energy. It's a startup that the venture fund I worked at invested in, and they're getting some great pilot projects. The chemicals like natural gas or hydrogen or other fuels can store for months at a time. And in fact, in America, we have a lot of natural gas caverns that do seasonal storage. We put natural gas into the caverns when we don't need as much gas, and it stays there for months at a time. Then we pull it back out. So you can do multi-day, multi-week, multi-month storage with fuels. And we could fabricate the natural gas from wind or electricity or whatever, or hydrogen, you name it. So we could use fuels. There are phase change materials. There are all sorts of ways to store. Lithium-ion batteries are getting the early market share because right now we're focused on 4 hours of storage, and there's a very robust supply chain for lithium-ion. But man, there's a lot of other ways to do it.
Okay, yeah, like my I've got a uncle in Scotland who talks about how there's you could use solar panel or wind power to push water up a hill stored in a tank, and then when the renewables stop, uncork it and then have a hydroelectric dam. So basically when you have excess power, use that to push, basically create a gravity battery.
It absolutely, and that works very well. That's called pumped hydroelectric, and we do it in Michigan and Colorado and California and Switzerland, and Norway has it. And you could take Irish wind to pump water uphill in Norway, store the water, then run downhill to feed Berlin. So you can create very large sort of connected regions and continents and islands and countries to do your storage if someone else has the resource you need. But pumped hydroelectric is the best way to do it if you have the altitude differences and the water. But if you're in Texas where you have altitude differences but not the water, or if you're in the Middle East where you have neither water nor altitude differences, it doesn't work very well. So that's going to be geographically limited.
Then on that note, how big can your grid get before it loses efficiency through just transmitting across the wires? I have absolutely no idea. Could we have a bunch? Could we turn Arizona into a big solar panel lot? Because I've driven through there. There's a lot of space they're not doing anything with, from what I can tell. But how far could we transmit that power? Can it get from Arizona to Maine, or will it be lost by the time it gets there?
It will lose power, and at some point the distance is too long. But if you go to higher voltage and you have more efficient conductors, you can move it longer distances. Thousands of miles, no problem. Tens of thousands of miles would be an issue.
Okay.
Moving sunshine from Arizona to Houston should be no problem with new high voltage efficient conductors on the transmission cables. And in fact, if you look at Houston, fourth largest city in America, hot and humid, peak demand in Houston on a hot day like today would be really high. That aligns very well with peak sunshine in Arizona, because peak sunshine tends to be around 1 p.m. You think like solar noon, that kind of thing. But peak demand tends to be 4 to 8 p.m. And that multi-hour lag is an issue because solar panels are coming offline around 8 p.m., but demand is still high because it's still hot outside. So you can use batteries to shift it a few hours or use geographic dispersion to solve that mismatch for you. So Nevadan and Arizonan sun for Houston is awesome. Can you move the power that distance? Absolutely. Can you move it from there to Maine? Starts to be pretty hard, but not impossible. There's some really high voltage power lines in Russia and China where they move long distances like that.
But you could have like North Carolina shipping
totally.
power up to Maine.
Eastern Seaboard's already connected. Canada's shipping power down to New England and vice versa. It gets expensive. There are losses. Generally speaking, transmission lines lose like 5 to 7% of the power. So that's like 93% efficient. You go really long distance, you might get in the upper 80s, and that starts to be kind of pricey. But if we do superconducting cables, if we get better at that and higher voltages, then we can build a bigger grid. And I'm thinking like Algerian sun to feed Europe, or sort of offshore wind far out in the ocean where it's really windy to feed California or something like that.
Are there any physical impediments in terms of the mining necessary to sustain the grid in just terms of the metal going into it, or on solar panels that would make it problematic?
Totally. So energy is very complex, and it depends in the end on mass. And that mass might be the mass of the fuels like oil and gas and coal, or the uranium, or it's the mass of the minerals you need to make the wires and the magnets and the motors and everything else. And generally speaking, the energy transition is a shift from strategic liquids like oil and even gases like methane to strategic solids like lithium and cobalt. So we're going from the fuels to the minerals that are operating the motors and batteries. And this means our use of the solids will go up a lot. And the one I'm most worried about, frankly, is copper. We're going to need a lot of copper.
Really? Okay.
Which is not a critical
It's
mineral.
not lithium, but copper.
No, I'm not worried about lithium at all. There's so much lithium around there.
Okay.
And the volumes in the end aren't that big a deal. But we're going to ramp up on our mining and extraction of solids, but ramp down on the extraction of the fuels. And the trade-off goes like this. If we really ramp up on a net zero world by 2050, we're going to need hundreds of millions of tons of solids that we extract from the earth by 2050. This is a lot.
Okay.
However, today we extract about 15 billion tons of fuels every year. So that's 15,000 million tons. And so
we have the extracting capacity, it's just that we're extracting fuel as opposed to minerals.
And I would happily extract 500 million tons of solids that we can then use for years and decades to avoid the yearly extraction of 15 billion tons of fuels. This is a great trade-off, in my opinion.
Okay.
It's still extraction. It's not impact-free, but it goes down by an order of magnitude. Well, that's a step in the right direction.
Okay, great. That's answered a bunch of my questions. In terms of as we get more electric vehicles, I had a conversation with the aforementioned Uncle Dan, and he brought up that power transistors need to cool down at some part during the day, and he was worried that if everybody's plugging in their car at 5 p.m., it would put a strain on the grid at a time it's typically not doing that. So
don't do that.
Don't do that?
Yeah. And transformers. So the transformers, which are like the gray sort of tube-like and cylinder things on top of the poles, they can blow up if they're overtaxed or they pop a fuse, got to place a fuse. And there's like a 3-year backlog on new transformers. And we have to install transformers as fast as we can because a lot of us are buying more computers and electric vehicles and induction stovetops and heat pumps for heating. So the load is going to grow a lot. And we're going to strain the system. And therefore, we should not all come home, plug in our electric vehicle, crank the air conditioner, and turn on the induction stovetop at the same moment. We should be thoughtful. And one of the easiest loads to shift is probably the electric vehicle, because if you charge it at 10 p.m., that's fine. It'll still charge up overnight just in time for your drive to work and that kind of thing. So we need to be thoughtful about that. And one way to be thoughtful about that is to not allow people to do it. That's kind of blunt force. Americans don't like that. Give a price incentive. It'll be 2 cents per hour to charge it at night, but $1 per hour during the afternoon or something like that. In fact, that's what I wrote about today for my op at the New York Times is demand response and paying people to shift their demand to later times.
So kind of like with carpooling lanes, except with electricity.
Yeah. Or your nights and weekends for cell phone plans in the old days and this kind of thing.
Okay.
So we can do some congestion monitoring. Oh, this is a congested time, so you can charge up your car if you want to now, but it's going to be pretty expensive. But if it's important, you might decide it's worth the price. But if you don't care, you'll just do it after dinner or something. And so we need to be mindful about that, is not plug everything in at once. And frankly, we should be mindful about that today, even before we have EVs, just to reduce peak on the grid.
My biggest fear right now is that the grid will go down in Texas.
That is a reasonable fear.
My dog and I will live in a creek or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think we'll be okay. I hope you don't have to move to Barton Springs to stay cool, but it is fair to be nervous.
With energy consumption, it's my understanding that we never actually consume less energy, that when we make energy more efficient or cheap, we don't reduce our energy output. We just expand the amount of devices we use for it. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So that's called Jevons or Jevons paradox, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce it. But this idea that as energy is cheaper, because it's more efficient, we will use more of it. If it's cheaper to do laundry, we'll do more laundry. If it's cheaper to light your house, you'll have more light bulbs on more of the time. If it's cheaper to drive, you'll do Sunday drives, this kind of thing. And there's some truth to this. They call it the Snackwell effect as well, by the way. Snackwell are those diet cookies. Oh, it's a diet cookie, therefore I can have more cookies, is sort of the idea. And there's a lot of truth to that. But at some point, the demand does get saturated. Because it might be if your air conditioner is inefficient, you'll cool your home to 78 degrees. And if you get a more efficient air conditioner, you'll cool your home to 72 degrees.
I would absolutely do that 100%.
But at some point, you won't cool it to 58. Like at some point, your demand for cooling your house gets saturated. So it levels off. And if you take that at a national level, the way it shows up in the United States is our demand for energy as a country has been level for about 15 years, even though our economy's doubled and we've added 30 million people.
Okay.
So that's a sign that actually our energy consumption per person has gone down in absolute and relative terms. It's stayed level as a country. It's about to drop because as we electrify transportation and heating, it will actually reduce at a total level our energy consumption by several percentage points. And that's fascinating. Meanwhile, around the world, for India and China, it's a story of increasing consumption, but they're also energy poor. They use a lot less energy per person.
Okay, that is fascinating. And I would think that LED lights would be a part of that. Like I calculated this the other day. If I want to, on my camper, because it's one thing that I installed the LED lights on, I was like, how much would it cost to run LED lights all year? And I think it was no more than $3 if I were to leave them on 24 hours a day. They were so energy efficient. And now all of the lights in my home are LED. So we are coming up with technological innovations that reduce. And I don't go buy more LED lights because of that. I've got a sufficient amount.
Maybe you add some outdoor lights, or maybe you add a few things, but at some point you're like, I don't need more light. My camper's bright enough or whatever. The example for this at a regional level is what happens in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. So Seattle is not very cold, not very hot, doesn't have a lot of manufacturing load. Most of their load is actually lighting of commercial buildings. And as LEDs came out, it sort of bankrupted the utility. It didn't really bankrupt it, but it cut into the revenues of the utility a lot because there's just less need for lighting. And it kind of got saturated. Like at some point, all your light bulbs are swapped out from incandescent or fluorescent to LED. Demand dropped for the commercial sector, and they had to rethink the business model of the utility. And now they've got population growth, they've got other things going on. EVs will probably save them. But for a while, it was a real hiccup at sort of a regional level or a municipal level.
I was about to ask what percentage you would want of our grid to be solar or wind, but I'm now thinking based on our conversation, that's the incorrect way to look at it. I'm guessing that it would just, you're very process driven of set standards on emissions and such, and then let the market sort it. So you're not trying to pick
the answer will vary a lot by region. So hydro is usually the best one. If you have hydro, do hydro. So that's going to be Canada and Brazil and the Pacific Northwest and some parts of like Appalachia and this kind of thing. It's not the answer for Texas, and it's not the answer for the Middle East. But if you have hydro, start there. That's usually a point. If you can build solar, do solar. So if you're starting from scratch, do hydro and solar if you can do it. And then add in some of the reliable, clean baseload stuff. If you've got hot earth nearby, like volcanic earth in Iceland or Kenya or Costa Rica, then you'll do geothermal as well, which they do in Nevada and California. So the answer will vary a lot by region. And you tend to go with what's the resource most close to you, that's most reliable. And then we're adding in a layers of, well, make sure it's clean too.
So final question for you. Not in terms of pie in the sky, like maybe we'll get fusion type stuff, but just right now.
Although we might get fusion. In fact, we've invested in fusion. So,
and are you bullish on that?
I am bullish, not anytime soon, but by 2050 and beyond, absolutely. And there are several fusion there's like a dozen fusion startups that have been written up because they've attracted billions of dollars of startup capital. And there are a few that have signed agreements and say they'll be energy positive like next year. Now, that doesn't mean they have a power plant next year, but that's pretty exciting.
Okay, that is
And we're
exciting.
going to need energy 2050 and beyond too. So I don't mind, doing some of these long-term flyers as well.
Okay, great. So noting that, until then, right now with the existing technology we have, is there any low-hanging fruit that we should avail ourselves to that would just be a simple bang for our buck thing that we could do to address energy needs in a more efficient manner?
The simplest things we can do right now in the United States, which we've already started, is to continue to shut down old inefficient coal plants and replace with wind, solar, and natural gas. We've been doing that for a decade or so. In fact, coal use is down 55% in America because of that. And the other thing is to reduce tailpipe emissions as much as possible with electric vehicles. And in fact, that's starting as well. So if we build wind, solar, natural gas in the power sector and shut down coal, And if we have electric vehicles, displace a lot of gasoline, our emissions will drop significantly. They're already down about 1 billion tons or so out of the 6 billion tons a year. And I think we can get it down to 1 to 2 billion tons a year pretty easily, frankly. Okay. The last couple billion tons will be harder, but the first few billion tons will be pretty easy just with those two things I said.
Okay, and real final question. In terms of energy production and climate change, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm totally optimistic. In fact, I say a lot of things on social media. I say a lot of regrettable things on Twitter, for example. And of all the things I posted on Twitter, the one that created the strongest reaction, like the strongest negative reaction, was when someone had the prompt of like, post the thing you believe that would make other people think you're crazy. And I fell for the bait and I said, well, I'm a climate optimist. I think we're going to solve this more quickly, more cheaply, and more easily than people expect. And this angered a lot of people. How dare you? Can you explain yourself? So I explained myself with 10 tweets in a thread of, well, students demand it, and investors demand it, and consumers demand it, and the cleaner solutions are higher performing and getting cheaper. And so it's just going to happen as a snowball effect. And we're actually going downhill. It's already started. And this made people very angry because there's some implication that market forces might be part of the solution, but market forces what got us into the mess. And so therefore market forces are villainous and this kind of thing. And I turned that into an article that I published in Mechanical Engineering Magazine about a year ago. But I would say if you have the honor and privilege of being in my shoes as a professor who works with thousands of smart students, you would also be optimistic.
Great. Well, I'm optimistic now too. Dr. Weber, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much.
That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Dr. Michael Weber, for coming on to teach us about energy. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. Fun fact, Eric insists on using a steam-powered computer. Giant, rickety steampunk contraption. I actually pay Eric in coal. Anyway, thank you, patrons of the show, who provide me money to buy coal. One time I forgot to buy Eric his coal, so I just found some rocks and I painted them black, and I sent them to him in a box, and boy howdy, did he get mighty sore with me that time. Anyway, until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.